Hello and welcome to the 2022-2023 Program Monitoring Random Validation Phase 1 Process Training for Title I Part C Migrant Education Program. In this session, we will be providing you with an overview of the identification and recruitment requirement. First of all, we want to share some things to keep in mind regarding this random validation process. Please note that documenting overall compliance for a program requirement may require several forms of documentation to be maintained locally and be available upon request by TEA and/or an auditor. Another thing to note is that to ensure overall compliance with program requirements, LEAs should refer to the program guide and/or other program-related resources that reference the multiple forms of documentation required to be maintained locally. In addition, keep in mind that the documentation requested for submission during the random validation process may not include all forms of documentation that are required to be maintained locally. If meeting documentation is to be provided for any requirement, please consider the following. The standard meeting documentation that an LEA should maintain locally includes meeting agendas, meeting minutes, notes, and sign-in sheets. Please note that documentation for virtual meetings is acceptable. Given the increased use of virtual meeting environments, participant rosters that include the meeting title, meeting date, and stakeholder names and roles would be acceptable substitutes for the more traditional sign-in sheets. This eliminates the need of a participant signature. We want to provide some additional guidance regarding the documentation request as part of the MEV requirements. The 2022-2023 random validation for the Title I Part C program will be requesting documentation for the 2021-2022 school year to ensure TEA is provided with adequate documentation to support the selected requirement. If the LEA did not participate in the Title I Part C program in the 2021-2022 school year, the LEA will submit documentation for the 2022-2023 school year. Identification and recruitment, ID&R. Identification and recruitment. The LEA identifies and recruits migratory children and youth, including adult school youth, according to the specific timelines and guidance outlined in the Texas Manual for Identification and Recruitment of Migratory Children in order to ensure the accuracy of such information. Migratory children eligibility requirements are defined in Section 1309-2-5 of ESA. ID&R 1.1. The documentation requirement for this is recruiter logs. Acceptable documentation. A few samples of recruiter logs for the previous school year. Again, for item 1.1, the acceptable documentation are a few samples of the recruiter logs for the previous school year. Issues that may result in an improvement needed status. Audible documentation requested was not submitted. Documentation submitted does not reference the recruiter logs. Documentation submitted was not for activities that took place in 2021-2022. Item 1.2, reviewer logs. The acceptable documentation for this requirement are a few samples of reviewer logs for the previous school year showing quality control took place. Again, for item 1.2, the acceptable documentation are a few samples of the reviewer logs for the previous school year showing quality control took place. Issues that may result on an improvement needed status. Audible documentation requested was not submitted. Documentation submitted does not reference the reviewer logs, or documentation submitted was not for activities that took place in 2021-2022. Item 1.3, COE error form. Acceptable documentation. A sample record of COE error forms from the previous school year. Other documents showing tracking and corrections of COE errors. Item 1.3. A sample record of COE error forms from the previous school year, as well as other documents showing tracking and corrections of COE errors. Issues that may result in an improvement needed status. Audible documentation request was not submitted. Documentation submitted does not reference the COE error form. Documentation submitted was not for activities that took place in the 2021-2022 school year. Thank you. These are the requirements to the Title I Part C Migrant Education Program as it relates to priority for service. We hope that you will find this information useful. Here is our contact information. Please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions.